I always say that I never sang any style of music that I hadn't heard in my household growing up. I can't approach it with any kind of authenticity.
She is one of the most versatile voices in American music history, moving effortlessly between rock, country, opera, mariachi, and the Great American Songbook. Linda Ronstadt built a career most singers only dream of: 10 platinum albums, 11 Grammy Awards, and a Kennedy Center honor. But online, a very different story about her keeps circulating. A list of feuds and betrayals with famous musicians, most of it invented for clicks. The real story is more interesting and stranger than the myth. It isn't a story about musicians turning on her one by one. It's the story of a singer who helped build one of rock's biggest bands, sang harmony on some of the most iconic records of the 70s and 80s, and then found herself at the center of a real, painful controversy, not over a musical disagreement, but over a decision to play a resort in apartheid-era South Africa. Long before the Eagles filled stadiums, Don Henley and Glenn Frey were unknown musicians trying to find work in Los Angeles. In 1971, Ronstadt needed a backing band for her Silk Purse tour, and her producer John Boylan helped assemble one. Boylan already knew Henley had sent him songs, and Ronstadt herself first noticed Henley's drumming while walking through a room at the Troubadour. She hired him, then needed a guitarist. She'd wanted Bernie Lee Don, but he was busy with the Flying Burrito Brothers, so she brought in Frey instead, who was dating her friend J.D. Souther's old musical partner in a group called Long Branch Pennywhistle. Rounding out the lineup were Lee Don and Randy Meisner, both veterans of the LA country rock scene. That band made its live debut backing Ronstadt at Disneyland on July 12, 1971. On the road that summer, Henley and Frey, who were rooming together, discovered they wrote well as a pair and told Ronstadt they wanted to form their own band. Far from feeling betrayed, she encouraged it and helped connect them with the right people. The friendship didn't end there. Ronstadt later covered Desperado on her own album, and Henley returned the favor by singing backing vocals on a hit version of Blue Bayou, which reached number 2 on the charts and earned 2 Grammy nominations. At her Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction in 2014, Frey stood up and told the audience that Ronstadt, more than anyone, had helped put the Eagles together. That's not a story of resentment. It's one of the most generous mentorship stories in rock history. Ronstadt's connection to Neil Young is another case where the real history is warmer than any invented feud. In February 1971, Ronstadt and James Taylor happened to be in Nashville for an appearance on Johnny Cash's television show, and producer Elliot Mazer brought them into the sessions for Young's album Harvest. Their backing vocals appear on Heart of Gold and Old Man, 2 of Young's most enduring songs. That wasn't a one-off. Ronstadt went on to sing on multiple later Young projects, including tracks from American Stars and Bars, Freedom, and Harvest Moon, spanning more than 2 decades of intermittent collaboration. There's no documented account of Young publicly dismissing her work or clashing with her over a protest concert. That entire episode appears to be fabricated. What's real is a long, low-key working relationship between 2 artists from very different corners of 70s rock. The idea of a dramatic, humiliating studio session between Ronstadt and Frank Zappa doesn't hold up either. But there is a genuine, if minor, footnote connecting the two. Back in 1967, Zappa recorded an advertising jingle for the Remington Electric Razor Company that featured Ronstadt singing. The company ended up rejecting it, and the jingle was never used commercially. It's a strange little curiosity from early in both their careers, not a story of public mockery or creative warfare. No credible account describes Ronstadt walking out of a Zappa recording session in 1974, and there's no documentation of a shelved collaborative album between them. If anything, the real story here shows 2 artists briefly crossing paths on a commercial project that simply didn't go anywhere. This is where the story shifts into genuine, documented tension. In 1978, Ronstadt recorded a cover of Elvis Costello's song Allison for her album Living in the USA. Costello was publicly critical of her version when it came out, a real, on-the-record disagreement between 2 artists working in very different musical worlds is rooted in the sharper edges of the emerging new wave scene, hers in polished, radio-ready pop rock. It wasn't staged as a scandal or a backstage confrontation, and there's no verified account of an insult exchanged in Cleveland or anywhere else. Notably, Costello's opinions softened over time. Years later, he spoke more favorably about her interpretation of the song. It's a modest story about two artists disagreeing over how a song should sound, not a public feud, but it is one of the few instances where a documented critical comment from another musician about Ronstadt's work actually exists. Ronstadt and Paul Simon did work together, genuinely and successfully. In 1986, Simon invited her to sing on Under African Skies, a standout track from his landmark album Graceland, which explored South African musical styles and won the Grammy for Album of the Year. Their vocals intertwined throughout the song, and it was released as the album's final single. There's no evidence the collaboration was tense, controlling, or unfinished. The track was completed and released, and it remains one of the most celebrated duets of Simon's career. But Ronstadt's presence on Graceland did stir real controversy, for a completely different reason. Graceland was recorded partly in South Africa during the international cultural boycott of the apartheid government, and Simon's choice to include Ronstadt as a guest vocalist reignited criticism that had already followed her for years. Music journalist Nelson George, writing for Billboard, described her presence on the album as pouring gasoline on a controversy that had started years earlier, a controversy that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with a decision Ronstadt had made back in 1983. In May 1983, Ronstadt was paid roughly $500,000 to perform 6 concerts at Sun City, a luxury casino resort built in the nominally independent Bophuthatswana homeland inside apartheid South Africa. The United Nations had imposed a cultural boycott on the country, and Sun City had become its most visible target, a way for the apartheid government to project an image of glamour and international legitimacy while segregation remained brutally enforced elsewhere in the country. Other major stars, including Frank Sinatra, Rod Stewart, Dolly Parton, and Elton John, had also played there before the boycott hardened into a firmer cultural line. Ronstadt's name landed in the very first edition of the UN's Register of Entertainers, Actors, and Others who have performed in apartheid South Africa, a list some called a blacklist. Unlike most of the other artists named, Ronstadt didn't apologize or donate her fee to anti-apartheid causes. In a Rolling Stone interview at the time, she said plainly that she didn't like being told where she could and couldn't go, and argued that plenty of countries had their own racial problems, asking why South Africa alone should be singled out. Her stance made her something of a lightning rod. Anti-apartheid groups picketed her concerts through the 80s. In Los Angeles in 1988, activists from a group called Unity in Action handed out flyers urging fans to boycott her shows outright. The controversy reached its peak in 1985, when Bruce Springsteen's guitarist Stephen Van Zandt organized Artists United Against Apartheid, a supergroup of more than 50 musicians, including Springsteen, Bob Dylan, Miles Davis, and Ringo Starr, who recorded the protest song Sun City, built around the refrain declaring they would never play the resort. Early drafts of the lyrics were even more direct, reportedly including a line that called Ronstadt out by name and asked how she could have done it, though that line was cut before the song's final release. Van Zandt later said the goal wasn't to attack individual artists so much as to build enough public pressure to help end apartheid, and has said he tried to avoid infighting with the musicians who'd played Sun City, assuming some had been misled about what the venue represented. This is the closest thing to a real betrayal story in Ronstadt's career, not a backstage insult from a jealous peer, but a genuine, years-long clash between one artist's stated belief that art shouldn't be bound by political lines, and a movement of her peers who believed silence and continued performances were themselves a political statement, one that lent cover to a brutal system. It cost her some goodwill in the music industry through the mid-80s, coincided with a stretch of her career built on riskier, less commercial albums, and left a mark that even a 2019 documentary about her life, The Sound of My Voice, was still grappling with decades later. Strip away the invented feuds, and what's left is a more honest picture of Ronstadt's career. An artist who helped launch one of rock's defining bands and never seemed to resent it, who sang on some of the most celebrated records of 2 different decades without controversy, who had one genuine on-record disagreement with a fellow artist over a song interpretation, and who found herself at the center of a real and serious controversy tied not to ego or jealousy, but to a stance on cultural boycotts that many of her peers came to see as indefensible. Ronstadt herself wrote about many of these relationships in a 2013 memoir, Simple Dreams, a musical memoir, which reviewers have described as largely a tribute to the collaborators who shaped her, the Eagles, Neil Young, Emmylou Harris, Dolly Parton, and others, rather than a settling of old scores. That's a very different document than the list of grudges that gets recycled in clickbait videos. It suggests an artist who, whatever her real and documented controversies, spent most of her career building relationships rather than burning them down. Ronstadt retired from performing in the early 2010s after a Parkinson's disease diagnosis made singing impossible, but her influence is still audible across country, rock, and Latin music. The real arc of her career isn't a countdown of musicians who wronged her. It's the story of an artist who helped build other people's legacies as often as her own, who took real professional and political risks, and who, in the one case where the controversy was genuine, stood by an unpopular position for years rather than walking it back for the sake of her image. Times Billboard, How Glenn Frey and Don Henley Became the Eagles, as told by Linda Ronstadt, 2016. Times American Songwriter, 4 memorable guest vocal appearances by Linda Ronstadt, 2024. Times Ultimate Classic Rock, Top 10 Linda Ronstadt Collaborations. Times Wikipedia, Under African Skies, Sun City, Song, Sun City, South Africa, Artists United Against Apartheid. Times Rolling Stone, Paul Simon's Graceland, 10 Things You Didn't Know, Stephen Van Zandt re-releases 1985 Sun City Protest LP. Times Africa'sACountry.com, Linda Ronstadt is still playing Sun City, 2020. Times TV Tropes, YMMV Linda Ronstadt. Times The Current, Minnesota Public Radio, Review of Simple Dreams, a musical memoir.